Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to whatever part of the world you are in at this moment. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series about human rights and psychology. Today, we are going to speak about human rights and the professional psychology identity. And we have very nice guests that will be speaking with us. They are Tony Wainwright and George Ulrich, and the moderator will be Aimee Karan from Lebanon. The hosts are myself, Alison Santos. I am a clinical psychologist from Brazil, and I'm also a member of the steering committee of the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights, and also a board member of the International Council of Psychologists, the both organizations that are organizing this webinar. And also another host is Mary Bullock from the United States. Today, in our webinar that we will be talking about human rights and the professional psychology identity, we will be also giving a continuity to the series of webinars that are happening since last year. And the webinars are organized, as I said, by the Global Network of Psychologists. You can know more about the Global Network in our website, the www.humanrightspsychology.org. Here you will find a lot of information and publications. Every month, we update a lot of information about the connection of human rights and psychology. And the other organization, as I mentioned, is the International Council of Psychologists, one of the oldest international organization of psychology in the world. And you will find a lot of what we do in the world and in our website as well, icpweb.org. Well, as I said, we have very wonderful guests today that will be speaking with us, and I would like to give you some instructions about what's going to happen. Well, first of all, you can ask questions. You can use the Q&A function or the chat box to ask your questions during the webinar. The webinar will be presented by both of the guests, and after we will have some minutes for them to answer the questions. The certificate will be issued automatically, so you don't need to do anything. You just have to attend for at least 40 minutes. And also, we turned on the closed caption function. If you want to see closed captions, they are generated automatically by Zoom. Please turn these on using the More function. And now I leave the floor to our moderator, Aimee Karan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Santos, for being the host of this webinar. I have the immense pleasure to present our guests, very distinguished guests, who are Dr. George Ulrich, who is the academic director of the Global Campus of Human Rights in Venice, Italy. And he was director and professor of human rights at the Riga Graduate School of Law in Latvia. Dr. Tony Wainwright, who is the Deputy Academic Director of the Doctorate in Clinical Psychology program at the University of Exeter in UK. And he is also the member of the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights, serving in the steering committee. I have the pleasure to give the parole to Dr. Wainwright. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Amy. I'll just share my screen and So I hope you can all see that and you can hear me. So again, thank you very much for that warm introduction. And just to say that we'll have our PowerPoints, George and my PowerPoints available for download after the webinar and some other materials. The talks we've organized into three parts. I'll do an introductory bit and then George will take over. And his section is about human rights and professional ethics, opportunities and challenges. And then my final bit will be wrapping up with some context about the work I've been doing. I'm a British clinical psychologist, so some of my talk is focused on what we've been doing in Britain with the British Psychological Society. And so there will be other areas of work in other countries that aren't covered, but I think it's sort of a bit representative of what's been happening. So first of all, I'd just like to say that the reason I got involved in thinking about this is a bit of a puzzle for me. And that is, why has psychology not really been very much engaged with human rights? Other professions, medicine, social work, have had much more engagement with human rights over the years. So this webinar, in a way, tries to address some of that and what we can do to cultivate this connection. And the other contextual thing I'd like to say is that we're going through times of enormous challenges. Global insecurity, inequality is increasing, the climate and environmental crisis, all of these things have major pressures on human rights. And so it's a time when we really need to think about human rights protection. And one particular change that's happened, which we wouldn't have known anything about in 2018, has changed an enormous number of things. And this has been addressed in terms of identity, which is the thing we're talking about, by people like Stephen Riker, who's a professor of psychology, social psychology in Scotland. And in a talk that he gave at the British Psychological Society, he says this: what's happening leads us to reconceptualize the basic questions in psychology, the relationship between the collective and the individual and the state. And this is because of public health measures that affected everyone. There's a free book to download that you'll have the link to after the webinar. And these identities are the things we're talking about. Being a human being, human rights is about all of us, but as citizen as well, because of our relationship with the state. As professionals in terms of psychology, we're social scientists, so these various identities are part of the story. And identity politics is an area that has become much more prominent over the years. And this book by David Pilgrim, who's a professor of clinical psychology, he's also a sociologist. He's written this book about identity politics, Where Did It All Go Wrong? And the thing about identity is, it does lead us to them and us sort of thinking, who's in and who's out, and who's one of us and who's not one of us. And the way he describes this in the book, I think is very helpful, because he takes a particular position in terms of what his relationship is to knowledge and to reality. And I know George talks a bit about ontology later on. So the idea of epistemology and ontology is throughout this book. And he takes a critical realist position, and people have other epistemological positions, but it's thoroughly argued. So understanding our identity as psychologists is helped by understanding this whole area of identity politics. I thought I'd mention this book, Professional Identity in the Caring Professions. They have a nice, simple definition. A profession is defined by what they know, what they can do, and the values that underpin them. Now, with psychologists, there's a slight difficulty here, and this is a bit of work done by some Portuguese colleagues, Miguel Rucco, who's been on the European Federation of Psychologists Association Board of Ethics with me for some years, and he and I have collaborated. They asked psychologists in Portugal some questions about what they thought was unique about psychologists. And the interesting thing was there was very little agreement about exactly what it is psychologists know, do, and what the values that underpin them. And I think this is part of the framework in which we need to think about how we identify with human rights as psychologists. Now, history, I think, is a key ingredient in how our profession defines itself. And in the British Psychological Society, we've set up a challenging histories group because we want to look at maybe the more difficult aspects of the history of psychology. And here are some pictures. The one at the top here is about racist aspects of the history of psychology. It's an interview between two educational psychologists, both of them people of color. One was working in the 1950s and 60s, and the other one is working now. And Waveney Bushell, tells the story of the racism that was around when she was working and how she tried to challenge some of the ways in which young Black kids were being assessed at the time and the difficulties she had. And it's a very revealing interview. And this is part of the oral history project we've been doing. On the top right, there's a picture of Hartheim Castle, and it's a blog on the Global Network webinar about the history of psychology and eugenics. And Hartheim Castle was when one of the first gas chambers was set up. It was a learning disability center with the Nazi T4 program. And psychology has had a role in developing racial, so-called scientific racism, which clearly isn't scientific, but also this whole eugenic idea. So we're trying to think about this past because this to some degree defines what we need to think about of our own identity. And in clinical psychology, a trainee clinical psychologist did as their thesis under Namisha Patel's supervision, who's a colleague and was collaborated with us in various ways. And his thesis was about human rights and clinical psychology in the UK. And he went through lots of documents in the archives of the British Psychological Society. And the essential story was that there wasn't much mention of it. Where it was mentioned, it was relatively vague, and it really wasn't followed up very much. But it's, you know, it's a long thesis, so you can read the whole thing from the link, and very interesting. But rights were around, and patients' rights in particular have been around in the UK and in other countries. The top one is a book published in 1983 in the States, and it's about integrating into general work that you do, patients' rights. And the language of rights has long permeated discussions of healthcare in Britain, American Journal of Public Health, talking about how rights, certainly in rhetorical terms, have been there all the time. But in terms of our profession, it's rather invisible, which is slightly odd, really. So what a group of us, Polly Hagenhaus in particular, has been a leadership role in all this, in trying to bring together some ideas about how we might cultivate human rights in psychology more actively. And we thought about education. And we had a meeting in 2016, which was where I met George first, at a wonderful session organized jointly with European Federation of Psychologists Association, George's Global Campus, and the Fundamental Rights Agency. And we brought together human rights workers, lawyers, psychiatrists, psychologists, all interested in human rights, to think about the intersection between these areas. And George and I wrote a chapter in the book, Human Rights Education and Psychology, which came out of this meeting, and also the Global Network also came out of it. So that was the work that we did together. So now I'd like to hand over to George, who's going to talk to us about human rights and professional ethics, opportunities and challenges. Over to you, George.
Thank you so much, Tony, and I say a warm hello to everyone. I'm just trying now to share my screen. It should be here. Yes, so I'll assume that's okay, and otherwise you'll let me know. Do you see my screen? I am very happy to join this session. I think it's both very timely and very interesting, and it's also slightly daunting. It's a huge field of exploring the intersections between psychology and human rights and all the possibilities and challenges involved. So we can only start to scratch the surface, so to say, but it's very exciting. I will just say a word or two about my own organization, the Global Campus of Human Rights. We are a network of human rights educators working in postgraduate human rights education. We run master's programs in 7 regions of the world, as is shown on the map here: Europe, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Europe, Caucasus, Arab world, and Asia Pacific. And we're in fact just in the process of setting up one additional program in Central Asia, which will be based in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. Our programs are interdisciplinary, and they're very much focused on educating human rights professionals for human rights practice, more practical oriented than academic, or for more than for research careers. And we are very interested in working with professionals from different academic backgrounds. We've worked with lawyers, obviously. I should say, by the way, my background is in social science and in philosophy, so I'm always someone who's been engaging with legal practitioners from a point of view of a social scientist and a philosopher, which I feel is a very rich dialogue. So we have worked with legal professionals, with social workers, as was mentioned, journalists, very much medical professionals as well, who are globally organized network of physicians for human rights. Very recently, we were contacted by a newly formed group called Musicians for Human Rights, and we've been doing a lot of work on exploring intersections between music and human rights, and how both the skill set and the resources and the ethos of people from different disciplines can contribute to the human rights agenda. So that'll be my main topic in the 15 minutes I'll be speaking now. But I would just like to start by sharing just a few very general words about the international human rights framework as such, without going into too much technical detail. We usually start in the aftermath of the Second World War with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here we see the chairperson of the Commission on Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, holding a print of the Universal Declaration in 1948. This paved the way for a framework of international treaties dedicated to human rights within the United Nations context. The 2 most important treaties, in addition to the Universal Declaration, are the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights from 1966, which together form what we call the International Bill of Rights. And in addition to those, there are a number of, there are several more specialized human rights treaties focusing on the application of universal human rights, in particular to particular groups. I should mention that these treaties, while sometimes questioned, sometimes contested, generally are embraced by states, by members of the international community. The 2 covenants, for example, have more than 170 state parties, each of them, which means that they're not exactly universal, but they're certainly approximating universality. And all states, all members of the international community are party to at least one, and usually several of these human rights treaties. In addition to the United Nations system, we have regional systems in Europe, Africa, the Americas, and coming also a little bit in the context of Asia. So this is really a global normative framework, which, as I said, is being questioned and challenged and contested in a variety of different ways, but nevertheless is the primary point of reference for international relations and politics in all regions of the world. In our teaching in the Global Campus, we're very interested in fundamental questions. What are rights? Why have they emerged in this particular moment in history? Why do we see them as so important? How do they gain their normative force? And again, what are points of contestation and criticism? I myself have been very interested in developing teaching modules and also outreach on issues having to do with what I call engaging with human rights skepticism. And I feel that's simply part and parcel of working with international human rights, to not have a dogmatic fixed set of views and ideas, but really to be open to critical and constructive dialogues. So that's certainly something I'm very interested in, but it's not the main focus in my presentation now. The main focus is really to look at who is responsible for upholding human rights standards, for human rights protection and promotion. And as treaties of international law, the human rights framework addresses directly governance, addresses governments, addresses state parties, because they are the parties to the treaties. They are the ones committing themselves both to individuals inhabiting the territories which they control. That's what we call the vertical axis of human rights obligation. Governments are primary duty bearers and individuals are rights holders. That's how we usually think about human rights. But there's also an interstate set of obligations where states are responsible towards each other for upholding a set of common agreed international standards. So that's the sort of core point of view and the core framework. Increasingly in recent decades, there's been a lot of focus on looking at how powerful non-state actors also can be seen as responsible for upholding human rights standards. That's especially transnational corporations, wealthy and powerful business enterprises, and so on. But there are many other non-state actors. There are international organizations, there are civil society organizations who also play a huge role in the international campaigns for human rights, as is well known, whether it's Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or Physicians for Human Rights or many others, Médecins Sans Frontières, for example. We as individuals all hold obligations towards each other and towards the community in terms of respecting the rights of our fellow citizens and our fellow human beings. The focus today, as we've set out, is really on a very particular group. It's on professional organizations, how professional organizations can contribute to this wider agenda in what ways. And as I said, there's been a lot done in certain professions. Probably the medical profession has taken a lead, the strongest. The legal profession, very often with specific focuses. You'll have lawyers particularly dedicated to indigenous people's rights, or children's rights, or women's rights, or the rights of migrants, or many other specific areas. The question now for us is how to envisage and to help to support the intersection between psychologists and human rights, as Tony was starting to map. In doing this, I'll just make one reference to a particular right. Of course, there are many different rights that are relevant in a number of different ways. Tony, we're talking about rights to non-discrimination, freedom from racial discrimination, and so on. As an example, one could mention many others. Psychologists, for example, have been very involved, and we work with psychologists in relation to rehabilitation of torture victims. For example, one of my close colleagues was former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and works very closely with rehabilitation centers for torture victims as an example. But there are just countless areas of intersection. One that is interesting, I think, is what's called the right to health. In 1946, when the World Health Organization was founded, the Constitution anticipated the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health as a fundamental right of every human being, without distinction. There is a somewhat similar or a variation on this phrase in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, but more importantly, when we come to 1966 with the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, we find the exact same right, but expanded to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And the field of mental health has been one of increasing attention in recent decades, with a United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to health from Lithuania, Puras, who particularly put this on the agenda of international human rights experts. So I think that's a field where there's clearly also ground for cooperation. Now, about human rights and professional ethics, and I'll just keep an eye on my time. And I should say, I've worked quite a lot with people working in the field of professional ethics from different disciplines, medical ethics, ethics for social workers, ethics for civil servants, Ethical for Social Anthropologists, and we've also developed initiatives on ethics for human rights professionals. And in most cases, there is a sense that that adopting a sort of framework and ethos for a profession is both a way of answering to legitimate claims for accountability on the part of the public who is enabling and supporting us, requirements for justification of how we handle difficult situations and difficult choices, and at the same time a sense that an ethical approach to the work we do in our professional capacity enhances the professional capacity, whether it's as scientists or as practitioners. In addition to that, I think it's very important that our ethical commitments are usually a source of identity, as Tony was talking about, and pride. So we take pride in identifying with the value base of our profession. Very often, professional ethics frameworks are articulated in a separate language from the language of human rights. And peculiarly, there hasn't been that much cross dialogue between specialists in professional ethics and specialists in human rights, even if there's a lot of scope for having such a dialogue. And I think this is something that we'll see increasingly emerge. So just taking some of the very fundamental and familiar principles of professional ethics, such as do no harm, contribute to a wider good for individuals or communities or society, respect dignity, integrity, and autonomy in our fellow human beings, principles of equality and non-discrimination, and so on. These are all core principles of every professional ethics framework and core principles of the International Human Rights Framework. And I think understanding of the sort of texture and detail of international human rights can really help to enhance and inform how these principles are understood by ethicists, and probably vice versa. So I'm really a strong advocate of strengthening the dialogue between these two normative discourses. One way of doing this is to embed some degree of human rights education in frameworks of professional training. There is a commentary, a standard on Article 12 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, protecting the right to health, published by a United Nations body, which in fact tries to define some degree of human rights education as a core element of the education for all health professionals. And I think that is something we'll see increasingly evolve. And at the same time, the sort of mobilization of practitioners to see themselves as part of the community of international human rights advocates and defenders, and in fact to see that commitment as a commitment in which one as a member can take pride. Now, how does professional practice intersect with the protection of human rights? We often talk about three main areas, or three main levels of one could say intersection. One is that professional practitioners, and this includes also psychologists, as it includes health professionals, may involve human rights as potential abusers. We don't like to think in such terms, but the awareness of risks, the awareness of a scope for contributing to what we also often call not necessarily gross and obvious human rights violations, but also in a broader sense, what we often call adverse human rights impacts, is something that we need to be aware of as professional practitioners. There is in the field of business and human rights, there is a lot of focus now on something that's called human rights due diligence, a form of human rights impact assessment where one takes stock of and monitors potential adverse impacts of our work. And I think this is hugely important. I think, Tony, you gave some interesting examples of areas where there is a legacy of such adverse impacts. And I totally agree with you that this is an important part of the professional identity to confront such legacies. Very importantly, professionals in different areas, and that includes very much also psychologists, often have a privileged access to information and knowledge, and they can act as witnesses of human rights abuse and violations. and by that very same token, very often as advocates for victims and for the prevention of abuse. And finally, there is a relationship between professional individuals and organizations and government, who are the primary duty bearers in the field of human rights, and the way in which professionals and professional organizations can partner with governments in a critical and constructive way to strengthen the human rights policies of society. So there's a lot to be done. I have a few slides on how this has been applied to the medical profession in particular, both as how medical professionals in a variety of different ways have been knowingly or unknowingly contributing to human rights abuses, how health professionals have acted as witnesses and advocates for victims. This has very much led to the creation of some of the most important now global civil society organizations in the field of human rights, and how health professionals work as partners and critics of governments. So this is something that would be very interesting to explore in direct reference to the profession of psychologists. I'd like to just mention, as I wrap up here, a couple of areas that I feel are particularly challenging and interesting at this juncture of history. Tony mentioned already several important areas, including also rising sense of insecurity related both to international conflict, as we are unfortunately witnessing, but also related to the pandemic, which has affected, I think, very much in particular young people and children. You know, we are increasingly focused on climate change and somehow trying to elaborate the anthropocentric human rights framework into a non-anthropocentric climate justice framework and generally environmental protection framework. I think the rise of artificial intelligence, which is something that's really taken up a lot of space in the media now, it presents potential for enormous potentials for abuse, also potentials for doing good. So there's just so much to be done and so much need for vigilance. And in addition to all of that, it's beginning to disrupt our core concepts of agency, responsibility, and human dignity, and so on. So there's really enormous both practical and conceptual challenges in this area. And as Tony was also anticipating, the deepening of social divides, as we're seeing, raises enormous questions. And it is uncomfortable for us in the community of human rights advocates to see how there's been this uncomfortable coexistence since the 1990s between the rise of an international human rights paradigm and a neoliberalistic economic paradigm, which sort of exists side by side and in some ways pull in opposite directions. So that's a big challenge for us as well. One could mention many others. And I'd just like to go back to my opening comment, which was that as human rights defenders and advocates, I feel it's enormously important to engage constructively with critical voices, with skeptical perspectives on human rights. And I myself distinguish between perspectives that challenge the very underlying notion of human rights, which I call underlying ontological skepticism, perspectives which challenge human rights either in general or in particular human rights standards from a cultural or religious point of view. Pragmatic skeptics who are looking at have questions about the realization and implementation of human rights, and then the uncomfortable coexistence of the human rights framework with political agendas both on the left and the right side of the political spectrum. And I think there's a lot to be gained from really listening and trying to engage constructively with critical viewpoints from different sides. I'll stop here, but I very much look forward to comments and questions, and I'll hand back over to you, Tony, hoping that it wasn't too many observations and comments squeezed into a very short amount of time. But yeah, over to you.
I couldn't unmute myself. Thank you, George, for that very interesting talk. Just to say, the skepticism that you referred to, you have a series of podcasts on your Global Campus website. We've got a link on the bibliography that you can download. They're fascinating interviews and discussions that George has had with people who are skeptical of human rights from these various positions, and well worth listening to. So this section, closing section, is about how do we cultivate a human rights-based culture in psychology. And this is really thinking maybe about human rights in professional organizations and how we make that stronger. And also talking to some degree about the professional personal intersection of these things. Because for me personally, there's my own history, how I came to this position, which plays an enormous part in why I think human rights are important. So it's not just psychology that makes me think human rights are important. It's part of the way I grew up and the things I learned on the way. So I've got a series of statements from different people, and Amy, who's our moderator here, contributed this one, and they illustrate different sorts of psychologists. And Amy's a CBT therapist, and so her points are about the experiences of her clients who have in a huge number of different ways faced adversity which are to do with human rights violations one way or another. And she says that some examples of this are gender-based violence, marginalization of LGBT community, childhood adversities, neglect, abuse, whole list of possible things. And anybody who works in mental health or healthcare, generally as a clinical psychologist or as a health psychologist, for example, will experience these sorts of people's challenges and the sort of ways you can help them using CBT. In this example, Socratic approaches, guided discovery, are all ways of strengthening people's resilience and helping them to realize their rights to empowerment and so on. And so that's an example of a therapist. And then Andrew, who's a member of the British Psychological Society Human Rights Advisory Group, I asked him, and he says, as an occupational psychologist, he's particularly interested in the right to a good workplace. And occupational psychologists have played an important role in the UK, and I think in other countries, in developing health and safety at work, which is a way of thinking about having a safe workplace, both from the point of view of psychological safety and physical health safety. And he's also interested in equality in the workplace and the whole things about status and so on. And so you could see a therapist and an occupational psychologist have slightly different angles on this. Marlena, who would have been here, but she's a teacher and she's teaching today, so she couldn't be, but she says she teaches future teachers. And so really her framework is an educational psychologist. And so a lot of her work is about inclusiveness, thinking about difference, getting the new teachers to think about difference. She gives an example of way our language is gendered. So there's words in Croatia where she works and lives for a female psychologist, and there's a word for a male psychologist. But female psychologists tend to use the word for male psychologists to describe themselves. These sorts of gender-based language has an effect. And then Polly Hagenars, who I mentioned before, one of the co-chairs of the Global Network, she has 3 layers that she describes of this intersection between these things. First of all, in her practice, very similar to what Amy described, dignity, respect, inclusion and non-discrimination, freedom to take their own decisions. My own clinical practice was in older people and people with dementia, and those sorts of issues are very salient in that area. And second, in her work, in terms of her social level of action, she's had half of her professional time dedicated anti-discrimination, intercultural education, anti-Semitism, and principally because these things have a major impact on people's well-being. And as psychologists, we're interested in people's well-being, so we need to be really addressing those things. And the third basic principle, which she says she sometimes finds it difficult to follow, is speaking out loud when something's wrong. And as an Italian colleague, Giovanna Leone, calls this parisia from Foucault, the courage to speak boldly. But she says, I think this is meant to be a joke, but she says it costs her backache. And I think speaking out as a whistleblower, or just being able to speak out against the cultural norms you find yourself in, can be very difficult. And then the last couple of people, Jenny is a sports and exercise psychologist. She's again on the BPS group. And she says she works primarily with young people, pre-elite athletes. And she says it's the protection of people in athletics and sport, young people, because they're at risk of being exploited in all sorts of ways. And the new chair that we have of the BPS group, she's going to be a co-chair, is also sport and exercise psychologist. She speaks about the position of elite athletes as well, for example, in the Olympic movement, and the need to protect them against quite serious risks. And as George said, it's to do with the impact of particular practices, the human rights impact of particular practices in sport, in this area of sport. And finally, somebody kindly said that I could, everybody's given permission, incidentally, for me to use this. It's Penny, and Penny's on the BPS steering group. And you could say she's an expert by experience. People who've experienced the impact of in this case, psychiatry, but it could have been a psychologist. And she has had many years of experience in international business leader, and she's now a coach, a psychological coach. And she says she's memories of aversion therapy when she wanted to become a woman and had experience of aversion therapy, and she has very traumatic memories of that. So the practices we use when we think about helping people when they are in these sorts of situations, whether it's mental health problems or all sorts of areas, we have to think about the role of psychology directly. And she says in her statement how keen she is for human rights to be at the forefront. She gave this quote, I've given a link to it here, The Man in the Arena, given by Theodore Roosevelt, where he says, you have to be in the arena. You can't be actually sitting just in the audience if you're going to make a difference. So I thought that was very nice having that there. So what we've been doing in the British Psychological Society, really following up some of these things, there's some links here. We've had some rather old guidelines on working with interpreters and working with asylum seekers and refugees. And our first job is to deal with government policy that they're just going through Parliament, called the Illegal Immigration Bill, which is a way of trying to prevent the boats coming across the channel and the mental health consequences for asylum seekers and refugees of some of the policies the government has, and where we have indefinite detention in the UK, where people can be detained indefinitely. These have very major psychological consequences. So we're going to be building on our understanding of social science to advise and advocate about these issues. And I'm very encouraged. Our first meeting was in February. It's a long time coming, and I'm very pleased that we've got that going. I think a key issue for us as psychologists is how we think about leadership in human rights, because we need our psychology associations and our leaders in psychology to take this on. And the global network, and also the Global Psychology Alliance, which people may know about, which is an alliance of maybe 50 psychology associations, has been taking a lead in human rights. But we need more research on understanding the effectiveness of different ways. And this paper, which I have a link on the bibliography, is about what the research agenda ought to be in leadership and human rights research. Am I doing for time? I think I'm still okay. Yeah, okay. So, so summing all this up, I think this paper that Nora Sfias, I'm a big fan of Nora. She has done an enormous amount of work in human rights work, and George mentioned the torture work Laura was very much involved in that. And she made some key recommendations. Norway's Psychology Association has had a human rights group for the last 22 years now. So this is recommendations from all that work. So these are awareness of responsibilities for reporting human rights issues. All psychology associations should establish a board. We should have focused in education and internationally, and we should collaborate. And so I'd like to just finish with a sneak preview of some work we've been doing in the global network, which is about what we're calling a framework for inspiration. So we've got together a group who have human rights groups in their organizations, and we're putting together this brochure that I think will be beautifully produced. We have somebody doing the design of it, and we have models from current practice, and we have a checklist at the end. So if anybody is keen to set up such a group in their own organization, these are the sort of guidelines that we think will help people to do that. So I'll finish there and stop sharing my screen.
Oh,
You need to,
I
there we go.
I was muted. Yeah. Okay. So, thank you very much, both of you. Really, Dr. Ulrich and Dr. Wainwright, for this very interesting and very inspiring presentation. I will start by a question, which is, I was thinking, you know, it's so much important when you practice psychology to practice, it's impossible to practice psychology without human rights, and it's impossible to believe in human rights without psychology. So how can we engage psychologists more into this culture of human rights-based approach?
Do you want to take that, George, or shall I have a go?
You start, Tony.
Okay. Well, that's a good question. I think there's two parts to the answer, really. I think education is one of the key areas. So I saw in the chat somebody talking about, you know, whether we need to be explicit about the connection between our work and human rights, because a good deal of what psychologists do, you could understand as a human rights based approach. They may not explicitly label it as that, but I think that so education, so continuous professional development, as well as for people who are, you know, just learning about psychology and learning about it in their professional role would be one way of doing it. But once they start practicing, the other thing to recognize is that you can understand a human rights-based approach by thinking about, somebody mentioned some of the conventions about people with disabilities, to think about what the rights are of people that they're entitled to. So you can have a slightly different way of thinking about this in terms of duty and rights, that people are rights holders and duty bearers. So we as psychologists do have some duties here, particularly if working in public services, to help people have their rights realized. So this is a bigger story than simply helping somebody as a psychologist to think about their well-being and so on. It's to understand that they're entitled to certain things, and that we need to understand that as duty bearers, we have a way of doing that. And so one of the things we're doing in the BPS is developing some guidance on human rights-based approaches in psychology. So that's a possibility.
Maybe could I just add a reflection to this, coming from the side of someone working in the field of human rights and with human rights specialists and advocates. I think it's very important how many of the issues that you're bringing up, coming from the side of practicing psychologists, Tony, resonate very, very deeply with current concerns within the human rights field and within the human rights community. So whether you talk about gendered language, you know, or you talk about sports and elite sports or healthy workplaces, and enabling and facilitating workplaces. And never mind rehabilitation of victims of abuse in a variety of different areas. These are profound points of concern for us in the human rights community, and we very much need psychologists to take part and to inform the way we think about these issues, I think. And I think that's a two-way traffic, because the more the people working, that the human rights field is not just dominated by lawyers with a very technical expertise, but is really an interdisciplinary field with many different perspectives and many different voices, the more it will also seem meaningful and relevant for practitioners from your side to engage with us, so to say. So I think it's very important to see those connections. I can mention that one of the areas in the Global Campus that has been very much in our minds recently is also working with children, not just in the protection of children's rights, but also engaging children, child participation, children's voices on human rights related topics. And one of the issues that they have been bringing up in a very strong way to us is concerns about mental health in the current era. So I think there's really there's fruitful space, for dialogue coming from both sides.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'll have a look at the question and answer to see what to have questions. So there is a questions about nutrition for patients, especially the hospitalized patients. So there is Hartono, who is asking, do you have guidelines, or how should we do for the rights of patients to have their rights nutrition?
All right. Yeah.
So anyone would like to answer?
Yes, I'm happy to just in a very, now I'll speak more as I'm not a lawyer with technical expertise, but nevertheless, I'll speak a little bit in how, a question like this would be taken up by human rights lawyers or human rights experts, for example, in relation to the right to health. And the right to health usually has two dimensions. One is what we call the minimum core standards, which should be respected everywhere immediately, no matter how rich or affluent a country is, and so on. And the second one are progressive objectives, where you seek to improve conditions and healthcare provisions and so on over time. I think a right to adequate nutrition, not only for patients, you could say this for inmates, for example, of prisons, or for many other people who are in an exposed position, would be treated as part of a minimum core of how you interpret both the right to health and the right to food, which is a sort of another way of articulating the same point of view. So the right to food is not just a matter of a certain number of calories. It's actually about nutritious food as a need for enabling a full and active life.
I have some reflections on this as well. Just imagining myself working in a hospital as a clinical psychologist, I might think that the food the patients were getting isn't anything to do with me as a psychologist. I might think that's somebody else's job. My job is to talk or something. However, I don't think that's a very helpful way of thinking about it. I think if we think about the life of a patient in hospital, we think before we think about human rights, we think about risk, the risk that they're being exposed to, the risk to their well-being, perhaps, if they're not having adequate nutrition, and also good practice. So good practice would mean good nutrition. So as a psychologist, I would be thinking about the way a hospital is being run much more holistically. I think if we, as it were, compartmentalize people's lives, we lose a great deal. And the thing about the human rights framework, it allows us to think in this broader way about all these areas, but it does overlap with something we would consider anyway, which is about risk and also good practice.
Thank you very much. There is another question that is for Dr. Wainwright. Dr. Wainwright, you point out that many psychologists address human rights related topics like racism, LGBTQ, discrimination, refugee, or health promotion more generally. But most of them do not choose an explicit human rights framework or human rights language. How do you think that it would be helpful for them to more explicitly consider or reference human rights?
It's a good question, and I think that the answer to this really is that it means we can have alliances with other groups. One of the important aspects, I think, of the way, for example, healthcare is delivered or workplaces is delivered is to do with policy and legislation, how those things frame everything. We have to think about the context in which things happen. And there's a thing called the power threat meaning framework, which the BPS has produced, which I thoroughly recommend, which is about the framework in which we all live. So people's well-being depends on the context in which they live. So if it's referenced explicitly as to do with a human rights framework, we would then have things like the Care Quality Commission, who are a regulatory body in the UK, who have an explicit human rights framework. That's how they judge the quality of services. So
Yeah.
if we have a particular situation in our workplace, we could have an alliance with human rights lawyers to help us think about improving the quality of the workplace. It's to do with alliances, interprofessional working, policy level changes to make the context in which people live more.
Yeah.
I would like to, again, maybe just to jump in and add just a further reflection. I mean, what we often say and believe is that while working with people who are absolutely contributing in a broader sense to realizing societal human rights objectives, the language of human rights, which also means explicitly engaging with the text of the conventions and so on, may shift the focus, and it may shift the focus from larger societal objectives, building healthcare systems, building schools, implementing certain policies and so on, that you complement that by looking at the same situation from the point of view of exposed individuals. I mean, that's what the human rights framework does. So it's about defining not just a societal objective to have adequate workplaces or good health systems and so on, but for each and every individual to have a right to be protected by minimum safeguards and to be able to make claims in case that is not those are not existing, right? So there's something about the language of rights which shifts perspectives, and that may be a helpful additional. It's not that it's either or, but it's a complementary point of view, I think, which is very important.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Do we have time for a last question?
Yes.
Okay. I was just wondering, maybe as psychologists, we need to be more ready to practice psychology that is more community-based. Like we are practicing psychology in a very classical way so far, which we are in clinics and we have patients and we have maximum group therapy, etc. I think that reflecting more onto the psychology and human rights, if we want really to make a difference, we need to be ready to step outside this classical way of practicing psychology and make a difference in the community, in the well-being of the community, in the human rights, in the quality of life of the community. Our role of psychologists should step outside the clinical setting. So the question is, do you agree with this view, and how do you think that we can encourage psychologists to be more involved at a community level?
Can I quickly have a go at that one? Yeah, thanks, Amy. I couldn't agree more. I think that in the UK, there was quite a lot of community psychology going on maybe 20 or 30 years ago, and then it sort of went out of fashion, but it's coming back again. And I think the particular stimulus for this has been the pandemic. You couldn't really think about the pandemic without thinking about communities. You have to think about the way people collaborate together. You saw at the beginning of the pandemic how people, the public in general, took action themselves to try and protect themselves and protect each other. And communities are very powerful. So the more we think about how we can help communities be self-sustaining, and George also mentioned the climate and environmental crisis. We're going to need resilience in communities in order to be able to manage extreme weather events. See what's happening in Spain at the moment, where it's just heating up hugely. So that whole area of applying community psychology principles, I completely agree. So just we need to. There's a whole lot of community psychologists we can get involved.
And just to come at this again from the point of view of people working in the field of international human rights, we've very often been criticized, and sometimes maybe rightly so as well, for having a too individualistic perspective on human life. And I can just mention we have colleagues from our sister program in Africa, based in Pretoria, the African Human Rights Masters Program, that's part of the global campus, where lecturers from the African program very often come to our European students and tell them, look, you should read the African Covenant on Human and People's Rights, because it's really more strongly than any other international human rights instrument putting a spotlight on the way in which individuals live in wider communities, in concentric circles, so to say. And that's something that's much more clearly thematized in the African Covenant than in any other instrument. And I think there's really a lot to be learned from each other in this regard, And I feel this is we have the similar discussions when we talk about people coming at the human rights from a left-wing political point of view. There's often also a call for more of an ethos of solidarity and communal commitment in the human rights framework, and I take it on board. I think it's very important.
Very good.
Thank you very much for this enlightening discussion. Dr. Santos, you may want to conclude.
Yes, well, with pleasure. It really was a pleasure. It's really enlightening, and it seems that there is a role for psychologists to play in this scenario in the world, right? And listening to you both, this very, very serious, very important role that you play and that you are doing, and how important it is that we can have this platform to share and to connect people, right? And it was wonderful to listen to you both, and also to your contributions. I may, as moderator, we had attendees from many parts of the world, and it was very good. It was really nice. So thank you very much. I'd like to share our last slide here to invite the attendees to our next webinar. Thank you very much. So our next webinar will be about human rights and forced migration, psychological contributions. The speakers will be Dr. Bridget Corey and Dr. Julie Hakim Larson. Moderator will also be Aimee Karan, and it will be on June the 26th, and it will be at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The webinar here that we just watched will be posted on the Global Network website. So tomorrow or after tomorrow, we'll be able to see the video there at the humanrightspsychology.org. Please complete the evaluation form. It's very important for us to have your feedback. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy and Ellis and Tony, but I also would like to thank all the contributors to the chat. I think there's really very many interesting observations, and we could address some of them, but not all, So.
Thank you very much.